or their arms have many more neurons in them in comparison to a mammal, where most of our neurons are in our brain and we have neurons out into our limbs. An octopus has a brain, but also has an incredibly complex nervous system out in each limb. So trying to understand how an octopus might experience the world is so incredibly foreign, because it maybe suggests that there's something that it's like to be an octopus tentacle, not just an octopus. So I'm probably getting ahead of myself a little bit.
You don't really see everything. For example, we have a clear view spectrum. A light, we can see white light, but we can see below infrared and above ultraviolet. But the same happens with everything. It's not just with the vision. That's one point. And at the same time, we see things in patterns. We can really see things. We just made constructions in some way of everything. But there's some work on this about predictive processing, right?
It's for me, again, a topic which is seeing a convergence of ideas, of different ideas, joining together and producing a really exciting time to be engaging with this science. And it's a combination of cognitive neuroscience, basic neuroscience, computational psychiatry, but also, base level physics and theoretical mathematics and philosophy. All the best topics in the world coming together with a very strong commitment to the person. So it's not abstract. It's not. It can seem that way in this field sometimes, that when we're talking about some abstract process, particularly when you read certain work and you think, oh, this is incredibly complex and difficult. But I feel like there's a very strong commitment to maintaining the person and their subjective experience at the center of it all, as much as it gets complicated in other ways. So that introduction earlier was just so nice in terms of the spectrum of visible electromagnetic radiation that we call light, that we can see. And I feel very grateful to a Year 12 physics teacher that I had many, many years ago. And I love maths, science, and physics, chemistry. They had one of those, and you have teachers in life. I had a fantastic maths teacher from beginning of high school right through to Year 12, George Small, who was terrified. Every young person in the school absolutely terrified them, because he was a terrifying human being, but he was also the most wonderful human being as well. And I got to see that side of him as I continued on. So, and then Year 12 physics teacher, I forget his name, but Gavin was his first name. And sorry, I'm rambling, but he was talking about electromagnetic radiation. I was learning about this physics in Year 12 and fascinated by it. And he pointed this out, that, what we call visible light is just, on this spectrum, microwaves and radio waves and it's, we arbitrarily call it light because as humans, the kinds of bodies we have, which is where the embodied aspect comes in, the kinds of bodies we have, the kind of photoreceptors we have in our eyes, our rods and cones, is sensitive. It's tuned through evolution towards this very narrow band of electromagnetic radiation that we call light and colour, which doesn't exist out in the real world either. And I remember him saying, and I'll never forget, he said, imagine if you could see radio waves, I went, what do you mean see radio waves?
Yeah, they are there.
And you can't, how could you possibly see them? And he said, radio waves are just the same, that electromagnetic radiation that we call, like, they're just very long waves. And he said, if you could see radio waves, you'd look at a radio tower and it looked like a torch, beaming and shining light, because you could see it. And I've never forgotten that. It was a long time ago, and it's given me this fascination, for the physical world and for physics ever since. And then maybe I lost some of that in the sense of my undergraduate physiotherapy training, which was anatomical and physiological. And then hopefully I've returned to it. And certainly the last 8 or 9 years, this field of predictive processing has just become, a wonderful obsession for me, perhaps, or a passion, but a great interest in something that I've spent a lot of time reading. I'm not an expert, and I haven't done the proper,
is there an expert?
Work. Sorry.
Is there anyone who's really an expert?
Yes,
it's like being an expert on evolution, right? It's a really big, huge field, right?
So we're talking here of the big names, Carl Friston, Andy Clark, Jakob Hoey, Anil Seth, and then the people that work with them and that are emerging in this field, and others that doing these the experts engaging with the material at a really serious level. My engagement has been in a very different kind of way, but with a fascination and with an open curiosity that I hope is just about a passion for learning and for understanding more. So I've mentioned four of the sort of the big names in this field, because predictive processing and associated ideas aren't just one thing. And that's where it's really, really challenging. So there are different kinds, different flavors of these ideas, and they're very old. So you go right back to Immanuel Kant, the philosopher hundreds of years ago, who was talking about the fact that we don't see the physical world just as it is, as you were saying there, that there's only the world that we can access or grasp because of the types of bodies that we have and the types of nervous systems that we have and so forth. So these ideas have been around for a very long time, and perhaps even back to Plato and his allegory of the cave and so forth, that what we experience isn't what's really there. That experience is always dependent on the experiencer, the person, the thing having the experience influences that experience. So it's taken me a very long time to accept what it might mean for colours not to exist. Colour is, for me, I experience colour. I know some people don't or have different experience of colour, but for me, colour is such a vivid, real experience. And then you hear physicists and neuroscientists and philosophers say, well, colours don't really exist in the real world. And you go, what do you mean by that? Of course they exist. I'm sitting here surrounded by colour. There are white walls, there's a bright red door, there's a black microphone in front of me, the screen I can see you surrounded by proper real books that you've read. I recognise some of them. I'm surrounded by fake books on my green screen, and the green is very, very real when I turn around and look at it. And yet this idea that colours don't exist in the physical world, only wavelengths of light exist. And then if we want to play with colour, we can demonstrate that our perception of colour is influenced by, our in a sense our prior beliefs about colour, our experience of colour, the fact that we've evolved on a planet revolving around a star with a certain wavelength of electromagnetic radiation that in the visible light spectrum that it emits and so forth. And it's quite challenging to think that colour, one of the most basic fundamental subjective experiences, is not real in the sense that it exists in the physical world. Color is something that we as observers bring to our experience because of the kinds of bodies we have. I haven't read too much on it, but I know that some insects, bees, for instance, can see a slightly different color spectrum. I believe bees can see more in the ultraviolet spectrum, and so flowers to a bee look very different than flowers do to a human. And some of the imagery that they've produced of flowers, quite remarkably, almost looks like the flower is pointing into the middle of the flower, saying, here's where the pollen is, and come in this direction. And together, flowers and bees have evolved, influencing each other in a mutual way over many thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years. Well, no, bees have been around for millions of years, but hundreds of thousands, a very long time. And so bees see the world differently. I've been listening recently to some books and ideas around octopuses, the most remarkable creatures, octopuses, and the idea that an octopus has a much more decentralized nervous system. It has a brain.
Like eight brains, right? A brain for every individual, something like that.
Yeah, or their arms have many more neurons in them in comparison to a mammal, where most of our neurons are in our brain, and we have neurons out into our limbs. An octopus has a brain, but also has an incredibly complex nervous system out in each limb. So trying to understand how an octopus might experience the world is so incredibly foreign. Because it maybe suggests that there's something that it's like to be an octopus tentacle, not just an octopus. So I'm probably getting ahead of myself a little bit with that.
But you're right. That's very interesting. Yeah.
So back to this notion of predictive processing, there's a number of different ideas, but they all center around, in a sense, an inversion or a turning upside down of the normal understanding of sensing and perceiving the world. So the classic understanding of the classic presentation was that we, as humans, as living organisms that can sense the world, have a variety of senses, and through the senses, information streams into our nervous system. Vision is often used as one of the more well-developed ideas. So light comes into our eyes, hits our retina, and there are features of the world, reflectance, edges, surfaces, and so forth, that information from those edges, surfaces, reflectance, wavelengths, and so forth enter our eyes, and they influence our retina, the rods and cones. That information is then passed into the brain, where it's processed, and an image is built up piece by piece of the world around us. So it's very much in the language of bottom-up approach, where data comes in, influences our nervous system, and the picture of the world is built up in piece by piece. So at a low level of processing is a notion of surfaces, edges, colors, and then as the processing moves higher up within brain regions and within processing within the brain, more abstract ideas and concepts are built up. So, a white object, I see a coffee mug in front of me, and it has color, it has shape, it has presence, it has certain properties that I can understand from a visual perspective, and because I understand what a cup is, I look at it and go, well, that's a coffee cup, sitting in front of me. So that's a very simplistic, but we're not doing as much justice as I could to this model of bottom-up sensing of how we perceive the world. Predictive processing, which has its roots, again, back in philosophy for a very long time, and then some leading figures Helmholtz is often spoken about, Gregory, another researcher, and probably most recognizable more recently is Andy Clark, a philosopher of mind and cognition, and Jacob Hoey as well, another philosopher, started to talk about perception as this combination of top down and bottom up. So this is and Andy Clark really coined the phrase predictive processing, differentiating it from a notion of predictive coding, which it's sometimes confused with. Predictive processing from Andy Clark in his a really fantastic paper, Whatever Next, from 2013, was a bigger idea of how the brains and nervous systems and living things like us, like humans, achieve perception, action, and a whole range of things. So predictive processing is the idea that rather than it being a purely bottom-up experience, perception is a combination of top-down prediction and then incoming sensory data, and a comparison between the prediction and the sensory data, which leads to what's called a prediction error, the difference between the two, and is prediction error, which is propagated up the system. So it's not raw sensory data that just travels along to our brain and different higher levels of hierarchy in the brain being processed to form a visual experience. It's prediction error. It's a difference between what's predicted and the incoming sensory data. The confusing thing is prediction in this sense isn't used necessarily to be predicting the future. Prediction is used in the sense of filling in the gaps in data or predicting the causes of our sensory experience. That's a common phrase used in this language, that what we're trying to predict is the cause of the incoming sensory data.
Yeah.
So perception then is a mix of top-down prediction of the causes of our sensory data. So that we're predicting what's causing the air vibrations in sound, the light being bounced around the room in front of us. We're predicting the causes of that in order to perceive them. So I perceive a computer in front of me with a camera sitting on top of it. Again, my microphone, the cup, my drink bottle, the desk, the room is a high-level prediction. And in the language of predictive processing, brains are in the business of inferring the world, making inference or predicting the cause of our sensory consequence, and then sampling the world with our senses in order to confirm or update that model. So another really important idea in this notion of predictive processing is hierarchy and models. The idea that we have a model, and this generative model, which is able to make these predictions about things and objects and causes in the world. And these predictions flow downwards, again, in the language. In some schemes, the downwards flow is only in a cortical hierarchy. In others, the downwards flow extends out from the brain into the body, right out to our sensory surfaces. And data coming in is met with these downwards flowing predictions. If it's the same, if the prediction can explain away the data, then we have perception.
Yeah.
But if the prediction can't explain away the data, then we have prediction error. And that prediction error is fed up into the system, and it can then update our model. And when it updates the model, that's when we have perception. So again, it turns things on its head. Rather than the world being given to us in a true sense, we, in the words of Anil Seth, we have a controlled hallucination. So we hallucinate at the world based on our model of the world, and we sample the data in order to constrain the model and just make sure that it's as close to reality as it needs to be for us to survive. So in this language, there's notions of veridicality, that our senses aren't veridical. They don't give us a true sense of what's there. They just are good enough to help us to survive. That perception isn't for truly sensing the world. It's for surviving. And so that's the sort of the basic idea. With predictive processing, the way that predictions and incoming sensory data and then prediction error can be processed, which is a processing part of predictive processing, can be optimized by understanding some fairly basic mathematics or Bayesian statistics. So predictive processing is often linked with notions of the Bayesian brain. Thomas Bayes was a clergyman. He lived in London a couple hundred years ago, and he came up with Bayes' rule, which is a statistical, quite a simple statistical way of updating a belief based on new data. And so the Bayesian brain hypothesis is that, in a sense, the brain constructs or has or is a generative model, each with multiple hierarchies. And each time there's prediction error, meeting upwards coming prediction error, meeting downwards flowing predictions, and the hierarchy, every level of the hierarchy is trying to predict what the level below it is going to produce and explain away that prediction error can be explained in Bayesian terms, so that maths can be applied to perception. And so these are closely linked ideas: predictive processing, Bayesian brain, and so forth. As well as perception, predictive processing is also used to explain action. So the classic model of action is that we have discussions of free will aside, we have an intent to move,
of course,
and we have a desire to move. So I want to pick up my mug in front of me, and I reach my arm out, I grasp my mug, I bring it to my mouth, and I drink what would now be cold tea. So I won't drink that. But the idea is that we send motor commands, very, in a sense, incredibly complex motor commands to the motor unit, and we achieve through incredible coordination the action of picking up a mug and bringing it to your mouth to drink. In predictive processing, turns that on its head and says, in actual fact, that there aren't motor commands, but instead it's predictions. So in order to reach out and grasp my cup, what I do unconsciously is predict that I'm reaching out and grasping my cup. So I predict that I'm doing that action, but I'm not. And so the proprioceptive data coming from my body doesn't match the prediction. Now, if that proprioceptive data was given the ability to update my prediction, I wouldn't be able to move, because my prediction that I'm moving and picking up my cup is not matched with the prediction error, because I'm not moving, so nothing would happen. But the way this system works, according to predictive processing, is that the prediction error created by not moving is attenuated, or it's given less emphasis in the system. And by having a downwards flowing prediction that I am moving, I can then allow reflex arcs, natural simple reflex arcs in my system to alter my movement in order to match my prediction that I'm moving. And when my movements match my prediction, well, then we have movement and we have action. So again, it inverts the old idea.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating idea, because in motor control, it's trying to achieve motor control through the fine regulation of individual movements and in if you take it to robots, trying to achieve this is incredibly difficult. And even a robot to be able to reach out and grab a cup and move it, it's taken years and years to even get anywhere near as close to what, you know, a 3-year-old child can do with, you know, with ease and control. Because the challenge of creating the precise motor commands to do that is incredibly difficult. And again, Andy Clark talks about the amount of bandwidth that would be required to send motor commands in the traditional sense to our motor plant, to our muscles and skeletal muscles to achieve that. Whereas a prediction of I'm moving and reaching out and grabbing my cup is much simpler from a computational processing perspective. In the old scheme, there would be an efference copy. So this is sort of motor control theory that at the same time as a motor command was sent down to the unit via the spinal cord to the skeletal system, an efference copy, another copy of that command was sent to another bit of the brain, and that allowed the prediction of sensory consequences or proprioceptive sensory consequences of that action, so that I would know that I'm moving and I could fine-tune my movement along the way. Whereas with predictive processing, you don't need that efference copy. You only need the prediction, and then you allow reflex arcs to carry out that prediction that I'm moving. So predictive processing, this is, I'm not doing justice to it, and I'm nervous of even talking about it because of how poor a job that I'm probably doing. But it's just incredibly fascinating.
I think it's very clear. You're very clear. Yeah.
And
it's understandable.
So we have Andy Clark's version, predictive processing, fantastic book, Surfing Uncertainty. One of certainly the key books to read in this field. And then there are arguments about just how this scheme is expressed in the body. So Andy Clark, who famously wrote the extended mind hypothesis with David Chalmers, another philosopher, Australian philosopher, would argue that the prediction and the machinery of predictive processing extends outside of the brain. Jacob Hoey, who wrote The Predictive Mind before anyone else, one of the first books to come out with these ideas, suggests that it stops at the brain, or even the dorsal horn, perhaps, that predictions don't go beyond that. So there is some subtle differences between the two. And Jacob Hoey's idea is based much more on prediction error minimization, so PEM. So you've got PP, predictive processing, sort of more Andy Clark's idea. Jacob's idea about prediction error minimization, that the brain is in the game of minimizing prediction error. That's its main purpose, is to minimize the difference between predictions from this generative model and incoming sensory data. And that leads to some subtle differences between the two ideas. And underlying all of it is, in Jacob Hoey's words, the deep, dark heart of it all, which is Carl Friston and his free energy principle, which has caused this, amazing ripples throughout the cognitive science world and philosophical world and computational neuroscience world. But, unless you're involved, have any passing interest in that world, that bubble, that little domain, then they're like gravitational waves. They're happening all the time. We've got no idea of them. We don't experience them. But Carl Friston's idea is really at the heart of so much of this thinking. And he's often spoken. He is the world's most cited neuroscientist, not because of his free energy principle idea, but because of his work in brain imaging. He trained as a psychiatrist, and he trained as a computational neuroscientist, and is, I would argue, in the proper sense of the word, is a genius. And I'll say here because it'll look like I'm predicting he'll win a Nobel Prize one day. Lots of other people have said that as well, but he will win a Nobel Prize for the work he's done. He invented or created a lot of the software that allows us to do the brain imaging, statistical parametric mapping, and the software, and from all accounts, developed this software and then just gave it away to the world. And it's used now in all the fMRI, the brain scanning application of that work and understanding of it. And I've heard from a couple of different sources suggesting that if he had licensed it, if he sold it, he could be a very, very wealthy man, but just gave it away to the world. And very quickly, this, and I worry, because it can start to sound like you belong to a bit of a cult of Friston because he's just such a remarkable figure.
Yeah.
He's an really fascinating guy as well. But his free energy principle has been one of the most complex ideas, and there's there are jokes now about how complex his ideas are, and
I don't quite get it.
No, you're okay. You're in good company because.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine I'm not sure what I get when I read about that.
There's a famous blog post, God help us understand Carl Friston, and there's now whole debates about what it means, and it's so incredibly complex that even people who are in that field find it challenging. So that's why I say you're in good company.
Yeah.
Again, Anil Seth, just finished listening to his fantastic book, said he was exposed to these ideas about 10 years ago, and it took him 10 years of engaging with and learning and trying to get his head around the idea to be able to write a paper with colleagues, critiquing it and engaging with it in a meaningful way. But it's complex because Carl draws from physics. So all of a sudden you read his papers. And you start reading about non-equilibrium steady states, thermodynamics, statistical mechanics. And you go, hang on a second, I don't even know what these words mean. Thankfully Wikipedia is there to try and get a sense of what some of the words might mean and so forth. But there was a lovely book out a year or so ago called Andy Clark and His Critics, and it was a book in a whole range of different authors writing about Andy Clark's work and how important it was in their field, and critiquing it in the sense of talking about it, not saying it was wrong. Although some would argue that he was wrong, and others supporting him. And Carl Friston wrote a lovely chapter, and he's talking about the high road and the low road to reach free energy minimization, or the free energy principle. And he was talking about Andy Clark with his perception and hierarchical generative models and downwards flowing prediction and prediction error, and this amazing work being the low road, not in a critical sense, but it's one way to reach that point. And he spoke about this free energy principle as taking the high road, just another way to reach the same position, but starting with some very basic ideas. And from, again, a lot of attempts, and owe a huge debt of gratitude to, I mentioned already, my friend Mick Thacker, who's very patiently listened to me over long periods of time and received lots of messages. I'm trying to understand this stuff, and he's out there now engaging with these people and trying to understand pain from a predictive processing perspective and free energy minimization. But Carl, basic idea starts from the idea that things exist. So right back to the very, very basics, something exists, things exist. And if things didn't exist, there would be no things or nothing. And for a thing to exist, it must be separate from other things. Okay, I can follow that so far. I'm happy when I read his papers. I can,
materialistic, clear view.
Yes, there are things that exist. And in order for a thing to exist and to be separate from another thing, it needs a boundary of some kind. okay, yeah, I follow along with that as well. It needs to have some kind of boundary.
Yeah.
And then he takes the next step and he says, well, in order for it to have a boundary, and this is not uncontroversial, and there are people that argue that he's got some of this wrong, and I don't have a deep enough understanding to engage in that discussion, but in order for things to exist and have a boundary, it must have what is called a Markov blanket that separates the outside from the inside.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm still with him. It's taken 10 years of me reading at my level to get to this point, and I go, okay, a Markov blanket, and it's not necessarily a real physical barrier, although it's often described in basic terms as a cell membrane.
Yeah,
a blanket, a boundary that separates the outside or external states from internal states. What's happening inside the cell is separated from the outside of the cell. Now, in order for that cell to continue existing, then it has to interact with the external world and states in some way. It has to have there's a transfer of, in the case of a cell, energy, in order for it to continue living. So the Markov blanket is made up of then sensory states and active states. So the cell can sense the world around it and then can take some action in order to continue to exist. And so that's the again, poor Carl will be rolling in his grave and he with my ham-fisted attempt to explain it.
I think he will be thankful.
Yeah. So with the if we accept that there's this notion of a Markov blanket, then and this is where it gets complicated, then and he'll show the complex mathematics which shows this to be the case. If things to exist, then they need to do so by continuously seeking evidence for their own existence. And this is where it starts to get, okay, what does that mean? So in order to exist, we have to continue to seek evidence for our own existence. We do that through our sensing and acting. And again, through the mathematics, Carl will show that, well, if that's the case, then it can be shown that in order to exist, we have to minimize this informational quantity called free energy. And free energy is not energy in the sense of energy that's able to do work in the thermodynamic sense, but in the a more informational physics and statistical mechanics sense. Free energy is an abstract quantity which can be compared to prediction error. So free energy and prediction error are interchangeable in some of the mathematics, which means that in order to minimize prediction error, the difference between our predictions and our sensory states, if we're minimizing prediction error, we're minimizing free energy. And that's the free energy principle in a sense, is that objects that exist are achieving this minimization of free energy. They're seeking evidence for their own existence based on a model. And so the model is, in a sense, not an abstract model, but the model can be the very structure of the thing itself. Constantly working to minimize prediction error, the difference between its predictions of its sensory states and the actual sensory states, and in doing so, minimizing free energy, and in doing so, over the long term. Again, I don't understand the mathematics, but I understand I just have to trust Carl and this and others that by minimizing free energy over a long period of time, we're minimizing or keeping a lid on entropy. The second law of thermodynamics, which suggests that we over time will disperse, or entropy will increase. So we're able to, for short periods of time, minimize or reduce entropy, which means we can continue to exist in our current state. So the free energy principle is just full of really complex statistical mechanics and theoretical mathematics and very well, but admittedly, very few people, can really understand it. And it's only been recently that people have started saying, well, actually, no, this bit is wrong, or the way that Freston talks about a Markov blanket is incorrect, and we should call it something different because he's taken some of the mathematics or the physics and he's all. I have no idea. I just have to go with it because I can't engage in that discussion. But the basic idea that we're that existing is minimizing this quantity called free energy by minimizing prediction error makes sense. I mean, I've got to a point where I go, okay, that's it. I think whether I can explain it to someone else, I'm not 100% sure, but it makes sense. And it fits with predictive processing. It fits with prediction error minimization. Yeah. It influences people like Anil Seth, who, as a neuroscientist, will largely accept notions that prediction error minimization based around this underlying principle of free energy minimization. And Carl will quite happily write down the equations which will demonstrate that in order for a thing to exist, it must appear to act like it's minimizing free energy. And it has, undertaking this in some of the mathematics, a Bayesian process of maximizing evidence for its own existence. Now, that's again almost self-evident, of course. We're seeking to provide ongoing evidence for our existence, and that drives behaviour, that drives living, and that explains a lot. So, free energy minimization has been called a theory of everything, which is in a sense a great risk because theories of everything can end up explaining nothing. But it's not a falsifiable theory in the sense that it can be true or false. And Carl Friston talks about this. It's a principle like
it's like a law, a universal law, something like that.
Yeah,
and that's
evolution through natural selection. Is a similar kind. It's not falsifiable in the traditional scientific sense, but it's a principle that then produces hypotheses and theories that we could test, and that's the work being done at the moment. And so now,
but it's very biologically plausible. It's very. I think that it's been accepted because of that. It's not against any biological principle we know. In fact, it helps explain more things than it helps, but it does the opposite. It's just helping understanding so much processes. At least that's what I have seen from a very raw perception. But I think that's the point. Yeah,
absolutely. And it there's discussion about some fine points of the maths and the ideas, but the fundamental principle has been largely accepted in large parts of cognitive science communities because of its power to explain so much. And so everything, so in mental, Carl Friston is a psychiatrist by training, and worked as a psychiatrist with patients. And so again, that's why it's such important that this incredibly abstract idea is still grounded in human experience, and the people involved in this work is still looking at humans. Jacob Hoey, who's based in Monash University in Melbourne in Australia, has written extensively with colleagues on autism and an understanding of autism and schizophrenia and how subjective experience can be altered and that alteration can be understood in terms of false inference or a breakdown in this process of prediction error minimization. So the richness of the theory hasn't even been, the surface hasn't even been scratched in terms of what it might help to explain. In a sense, it's not a theory of anything. As you said, it's a law or it's a principle, which then can suggest theories and give a very strong mathematical basic physics underpinning to life, to perception, to almost anything that you want to turn it to. It can help explain behavior as well.
Yeah.
So what I think will happen,
and sleeping, and I've seen a lot of things. Yeah.
Yeah. And what I'm hoping is that over time,
even cycles. Yeah.
Yes, very smart people will be able to understand it and then translate it for simple people like me. Go, okay, that's what I mean. In the meantime, I'm endlessly looking up the words in the Carl Friston paper. What does that even mean? And every time you think,
you have to read books. You have to read a lot of books to understand it.
New terms will come up.
I think that's good. I think that's a very good thing, right?
I hope so, and I hope my engagement with it is one of great. Well, it is great curiosity and awe and respect for the people doing the work, and a hesitation to try and explain the things that I'm interested in with this idea, because I think there's the risk of not completely understanding these ideas and then applying it to something like pain, that something that is, I guess, at the core of what I'm interested in, is what I'm doing in work, and misconstruing the ideas, not understanding the ideas, because I can't engage with the really complex theoretical and mathematical components of it, and taking a simplistic surface level understanding and applying it. And the danger there, I think, is, it's like a new toy. When a child gets a new toy, it just wants to play with it all the time. And I think it might be controversial in saying it, but sometimes in my experience, the physiotherapy profession has been a bit like that, where it's found a new toy and it just won't stop playing with it. And if we look back through even recent history, one of those toys was, for a period of time, motor control. So if we looked at the sense of motor control in low back pain, and the original papers which showed that we could measure very precisely the timing of transversus abdominis and multifidus and other, trunk musculature, and we could see there was a difference in people that had low back pain and they didn't have low back pain when they did a fast arm movement, and that toy, that ability to measure that, led to this industry of motor control, core stabilization, and that was the explanation for back pain. And it wasn't the intent, but perhaps in hindsight, you think this was an interesting discovery, interesting finding. We didn't really know what it meant, but all of a sudden it became linked with pain and became a clinical thing. So now, everyone was doing, pressure biofeedback and teaching people to contract multifidus and transversus abdominis. We had our ultrasound machines and looking at looking for contractions and telling people that was the cure for pain. So that was the toy. And then another toy, neuroscience, in a sense, I think in some ways was a toy for physiotherapy. And people that weren't really neuroscientists doing the really proper hardcore neuroscience took this toy, the brain, and used it to explain everything. And without fully understanding, and we saw a lot of metaphor, we saw a lot of ideas that seemed like neuroscience, but weren't really proper neuroscience in the sense that coming, they were based on ideas at the time, but that they haven't been dated. So my concern for me is, is this a new toy in predictive processing and free energy minimization to talk about and say, now we've got the answer. No, it's not motor control. It's not the brain and neuroscience. It's this, it's predictive processing. I've seen that happen a little bit, and there are some ideas out there that have been sort of hanging around for a while, and all of a sudden predictive processing was popular, and it was was used to maybe support these ideas. So one particular approach.
Sorry. Go on.
No, that's
there's some success with some of these ideas, maybe, such as Stanton doing this visual, how you call it, changing the perception of moving your knee, and that may help. But I don't know if you were going somewhere different. But
that's one example. The other was, and I can't. What's the expectation violation? So that has been put forward as a treatment idea. This idea of violating a person's expectation about what they can do with their body and whether or not to experience pain. And then predictive processing was being talked about, this idea of prediction and prediction error. And there was some, and again, this was through, a superficial exposure, but seeing discussions on social media and so forth, saying, expectation violation uses prediction processing, prediction error minimization as a theoretical framework to explain why it works. And I feel there's a danger there of taking a new toy, predictive processing, and applying it to something which is our favorite idea, expectation violation, saying, see, here's the evidence now that for why it works. The danger there, of course, is that an expectation violation will lead to a prediction error, and a prediction error certainly can update a model, but the predictive processing idea is much more complex than that in a sense, and not all prediction error gets to update a model, depending on precision or likely, these other ideas that form part of, again, the Bayesian mathematics, but also the predictive processing thinking. And the danger of expectation violation is it could strengthen a model that you're supposedly trying to change through that approach. So it could go the other way. And so predictive processing may or may not provide evidence for why sometimes this approach, expectation violation, seems to work for some, but for others it doesn't. That, I guess, again, is just perhaps a slightly cynical take on my profession, but we'll tend to grab onto these things and go, okay, now we're going to bring it into our our explanations, and we'll take it without fully understanding it, and we'll take it to the clinic and tell patients about it, and we just have to be careful with that. And so I'm very wary of that, and I think I wouldn't feel comfortable at the moment teaching people about how to treat pain using predictive processing principles, because I don't think we know, what this incredible world can do is to give us lots of ideas and new ways of thinking, and then we can start to explore what that might mean for people experiencing pain, and what it might mean for treatment in the future. And in some instances, what it will mean is that some of the things that we've been doing for a very long time, we're going to keep doing, but we're going to give them a different explanatory framework. It might also help to explain why pain is so individual, and why one thing might work for someone and not work for someone else. That's sort of there in the predictive processing thinking, and it will maybe it will challenge the idea that we can get 120 people in a study, a big, robust study with 120 subjects, and do the same thing to all 120 people and expect there to be the same result, and for there to be some kind of big difference in that group of 120 compared to 120 control. And I know
it sounds so obvious.
Predictive processing supports the fact that we are incredibly individual with our past experiences forming our generative model. We share a lot in common, but we're also very different and unique. So, it sounds so cliche to say, but what works for someone might not work for someone else. Why? Well, it fits in with ideas around predictive processing, which, similar to notions and fits with complex systems thinking and new ways of thinking. So in a sense, it might not fundamentally change what we do, but it might give us some hope and different ways of thinking about what we do, and not assuming that we can just do the same for everyone and it will work. And that if you compare large groups of people with a singular treatment, it's probably not going to be much difference between the groups. So all of these ideas come out, and this is philosophy of science, and there are others doing this work. The Cause Health group from a few years back, with philosophers and people like Roger Carey who are involved, and Matt Lowe and Stephen Mumford and Rani Anjum, and philosophers looking at the fundamentals of research in health, and arguing that the RCT, randomized controlled trial, might not be the gold standard we thought it was, and fantastic work and really clever ideas. And I all share, fit together nicely. There's not a contradiction between a lot of this modern thinking. So for me, I'm going to keep reading, Friston as best as I can, and my advice is to just to keep reading, and when you hit the first equation, just keep going. That's just keep going.